Welcome to the Real Estate Fight Club, a podcast for agents where you'll witness a battle of opinions about topics affecting your real estate business. There are many ways for agents to achieve success. The secret is to find which approach will work for you. Now, always in your corner, here are your hosts, Jen Murtland and Monica Weakley.
Welcome to Real Estate Fight Club. This is a series called Better Call Saul, where we discuss what is currently possible, that if it were impossible, or what is currently impossible, that if it were possible, would fundamentally change the way that we do business as real estate agents. On today's episode, we are going to do an update on the buyer-broker commission lawsuits. And here with me today is my co-host, RachaelReal, broker owner of Rachael Real Estate in Chicago. She's been an agent for over 18 years, has been on the Pro Standards Committee for 8 of those years, currently serving as the 3 times past chair. And she is passionately nerdy about all things real estate, especially those rules. Right, Rachel?
I am. Morning, guys. How are you?
Morning.
Morning.
With us today, too, we have Saul Klein, and Saul is the godfather of real estate technology. Saul has been licensed to sell real estate for over 47 years. He was an original team member of Realtor.com and the creator of NAR's technology certification we know as ePro. Saul was personally responsible for the first 500,000 listings to be displayed to the public on Realtor.com, spearheading listing syndication, which is the distribution of your listings to the consumer over the internet. Welcome today, and let's dive into the topic. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the update to the Morrill and Sitzer Burnett lawsuits that are filed against NAR and how it affects the real estate industry in general, as well as our buyer-broker compensation and our buyer-broker agreements. So Saul, give us a recap on where we're at.
Well, let's put it in the context of what's currently possible, what's currently impossible.
Right.
There you go.
Right. What's currently possible is you can work with a buyer and you can present offers on a property and you can be compensated. And as a matter of fact, because of the nature of the structure of MLS, which is an offer of compensation, you don't even worry too much about it. You just go ahead and do your duty and you present the offer and you're pretty much assured that you're going to get paid in some range. Now, that's where the question is, what range? But we know consistently for years it's fallen within a certain range. And so what is currently possible is little thought going into the compensation that you will be given if you participate in a multiple listing service. And so the question then is, what if it weren't that easy?
As a buyer's rep.
On the buyer side, what if now it wasn't an automatic where you got compensated? Right. Because what if the MLS rules changed and the MLS no longer was an offer of compensation? And a lot of people might say, oh, that'll never happen. Oh, I'm worth my money. Oh, I know that I can.
Oh, my God. It's happening.
Time out, because it's happening.
But the fact is it's happening. And we can put cases out in front of people to show them it's happening. They're still in denial.
They're in denial. Yeah.
Right.
So there was something that just came down recently where it's a proposed settlement. Yes. Tell us about that. Yeah.
So first of all, we had the Sitzer and Mueller, which are civil cases, and they're saying that sellers had spent millions of dollars more than they needed to because they were forced to offer compensation to buyers agents and they shouldn't be. And those cases have been certified as class action and they're moving forward. And people are telling us that they're $1 billion possible damages. And Sitzer, Rachel, you said October they're looking at that going to trial, and next year they're looking at Mueller, which is a bigger case, going to trial. Exactly. And then the DOJ is saying to NAR, the Department of Justice, to the National Association of Realtors, that buyer compensation club, broker compensation that offers the commission to buyer brokers, that really is antitrust, and that's really costing a lot of money. So the DOJ is going after NAR. And then we've got these civil cases. And so Friday, though, we saw where a large MLS in the New England area, MLS PIN, Property Information Network, huge. Matter of fact, I facilitated the first strategic plan for MLS PIN. And I don't remember the year, but it was a long time ago. And it's a great, very successful MLS. But they've been involved. They've been sued. Same idea. That the sellers were paying compensation. They're kind of forced into it. They didn't know, to buyer brokers. And
I think and part of that too is they were forced into it, and they also didn't have an opportunity to negotiate it. They were just kind of flat out told, "This is what we're paying."
But doesn't that depend
that's
on?
the crux of it.
I mean, I don't know if that's actually like true.
I think, well, that's a whole nother issue.
Right.
Okay.
So now we're talking about the degree of disclosure and the amount, and there's actually a term for informed consent.
Sure.
Right. I mean, that's a whole.
We've thought about this before.
Right.
Sure,
But here's the issue that happened on Friday was that big MLS agreed to pay $3 million in a settlement with plaintiffs. $3 million in their class action, and most people didn't even know MLS PIN was involved in this. We're all focused on Sitzer and Moeller and the DOJ and NAR,
right?
And then we read $3 million settlement, even though they're saying they didn't do anything wrong, and this is not precedent. A $3 million is a significant amount of money.
Yeah, but if I'm them, I'm thinking, look, if I didn't do anything wrong, we don't believe that we did anything wrong as the MLS. We believe there was informed consent. I'm still settling and thanking my lucky stars that I can get with $3 million settlement. Because if I believe that the perception is that there's something wrong here and that that's going to
could be far higher.
It's going to be way more than $3 million. And
it's damage control at that point.
Exactly. You're mitigating your liability. So I want to make sure that people understand why this matters. This matters because most agents are buyer's agents. I mean, a lot of people are, and that's how they make their money, but they're not getting buyer agreements, even though Rachael and I tell you to all the time, you're not getting a buyer agreement. But if the MLS, so talk more about like the settlement, $3 million, and what do they have to do or not have to do?
Yeah, so a $3 million settlement, of which about $1 million, almost a little less than about 1.4 million is going to go to pay fees and costs and attorneys, but the other 1.6 million is going to go into a settlement fund to fund the cases against the other defendants. And the other defendants are those big brokerage entities. I've got the list here: Anywhere Real Estate, which is Realogy, Century 21 Real Estate, Coldwell Banker Real Estate, Sotheby's, Better Homes, ERA, Home Services, BHH, Remax, Keller Williams. These are big entities, and
these are all the big ones, the big players.
So $3 million, the MLS puts up the money. It's kind of interesting because that money is going to be used to go against the customers,
their customers
of the MLS. Right. But you got to think they talked about this at the MLS level and agreed. And
for sure.
Right. And this is the best way to do it. Now the other defendants are on their own. So $3 million settlement, $1.6 million going into a fund to help fund, and MLS PIN is going to cooperate with the plaintiffs on this. So that's a big deal, right? Now, how will it change?
And also now, how will that in the MLS, when you're the listing agent and you're entering in the listing, is it now no longer an offer of compensation, or what changes there?
So here's what the settlement is, right? It's a kind of injunctive relief, Rachael, is that what they call it? Number one, it stops this antitrust practice, or what they're calling it. It stops that.
Right.
And then there's these monetary damages. So the injunctive relief is, number one, eliminating the requirement that a seller must offer compensation to a buyer broker. What we've seen across the country is, first of all, it was $1, only have to offer. And then they said, you could offer, it's still an offer of compensation, but it's $0. Now what this settlement is saying, it's eliminating the requirement that so in their documentation somewhere, their MLS has to eliminate this requirement for anything, not just.
Then does that in and of itself eliminate the MLS, because the MLS was built as an offer of compensation? Yes.
No, I don't think it
wasn't originally built that way, though. It was originally built. It was originally built as a marketing tool so that you could get your listings out to the other membership.
Yeah, it was originally set up, but I said originally it was marketing, but it evolved, and it probably didn't take long for this to happen, into a unilateral offer of sub-agency, And
Right.
it remained a unilateral offer of sub-agency until about 1992. And
Right.
everybody represented the seller in a real estate transaction. That's the way it was. And since you represented the seller, even if you brought in the buyer, you were entitled to a portion of the commission. That's the way
Right.
that it worked, right? Is that you were
Right.
entitled to a portion of the commission because you represented the seller, even though you didn't take the listing, because you became a sub-agent of the listing broker. That
Right.
changed in 1992. They eliminated the sub-agency model, and what came in to replace this, to hold the compensation piece together, was the offer of compensation. And so now what this litigation is saying across the country, and then we're talking about this particular case, is that's going to be eliminated from this MLS, right?
So as a buyer's, can I ask a question real quick? Okay, so as a buyer's agent, and I'm in this MLS, or, you know, we see this as the future, right? And there's no offer of compensation for a listing that my buyer client wants to see. And am I expecting my compensation? Am I expecting to negotiate it with the listing agent? Or is it being negotiated with the seller, or am I negotiating with the buyer?
So this is all going to work out over time. But back to this case, back to this case, it's going to eliminate the requirement. That doesn't say a seller can't offer a commission. Seller might say, "Oh,
but
you know what?
The commission also is not allowed to be part of the purchase contract, correct?"
Well, that's all going to change. So
it's all going to change.
Now, remember, this can be done. This is a private, what we call a broker-owned MLS. This is not an NAR MLS. Just like Northwest MLS that changed their rules in October of last year, this is a private MLS. So they don't have to abide by the broker compensation clause. They can just eliminate it. Other MLSs can't just eliminate it if they follow the NAR model, not until NAR eliminates it. So what they've done is they've said in this case, and it's still, the mechanisms are going to take a while for people to get used to. Number one, it's eliminated. It doesn't mean that the seller can't. Now, if you're the seller, you might say, "Hey, I want you to put it in the MLS. I want to offer 0, and let's see what the market does. I'm not going to offer any compensation to a buyer broker. Let's just see what shakes out here."
Right.
So when the agent who is taking the listing, number one, no requirement that the seller pay anything. And then number two, this settlement requires the broker for the seller to provide notice to the seller that A, the seller is not required to offer compensation. You have to tell them, you have to give them notice. Now you have to know that you're not required to pay a buyer. No, you don't really have to say that.
It's not necessarily required now. If you go back to look at all of the, what is it? What's the company REFC that had all the over 700 phone calls that were listened in on, and that it was fodder for the lawsuits anyway, because these sellers were offering no buyer agency compensation to the buyer representative. So if Saul saw a listing down the street and called me as his broker, I called REFC and said, "Hey, I'm interested in showing this property. What is the compensation?" And they said, "Well, we don't pay, but seller doesn't pay any buyer compensation whatsoever." And then you had 700 phone calls where the buyer's agents were saying things like, "Well, then I'm just not going to show it. You have to pay it." It was a whole litany of answers, all of which were inappropriate. So that's part of the problem.
And most agents don't even understand how this works. And when they go in and take a listing, they don't say that. They say, "I'm going to charge you 6%.
No.
And they may or may not say, "I'm going to share that commission with them." They may or may not.
Right.
And I would bet that pretty much most people in the industry that take listings don't present this to a seller in a way that they can make an informed choice.
You know what? This is a case for blowing this whole thing up and starting over.
Well, that's kind of what's happening. We're just being forced to do it.
So again, back to this injunctive relief. Number one, they're saying in this MLS, you don't have to pay, and you can, but you don't have to.
It's not a requirement anymore.
Agents, you have to tell the seller, you have to make it clear to them, A, that's not required to offer compensation to a buyer broker, and if the buyer broker requests compensation from the seller can decline.
Right.
So you have to disclose this you say, "Okay, now you're going to pay me a commission, and you don't have to offer commission to the buyer agent, And if the buyer agent asks for a commission, you don't have to accept it.
Right.
You can
Sure,
decline
but
it.
if you're like, if
That's a
I'm
big-
looking now, I only have access to like our, a handful of purchase contracts. But when I look at them, it's like in all the contracts that I've seen, the listing contracts, it is laid out there.
It is now. Like our MLS here came out with a new list, or our board came out with a new listing agreement maybe 2 months ago that broke down the commission section of the listing agreement from, about this much of a page to 3/4 of a page. And
Right.
now it lists out every last thing, and it forces that disclosure and conversation between the listing agent and the seller to explain every single scenario that could possibly come up and how are we going to address it. If there's an unrepresented buyer, if there's a buyer with an agent, if there's a dual agency, if there's, you name it, they cover it.
So if I'm a seller, I'm going to be like, I'm not, what is the benefit of me offering this compensation? Like, why would I do that?
And the appropriate answer to that would be that, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, buyers don't necessarily have a whole lot of extra money sitting around to pay their buyer agent. So they may ask for you to cover part of that expense, and it's up to you whether or not you want to do that.
So, and even this, and you're right, Rachel, now they've expanded. What they've done is given agents more tools to explain to sell.
Right.
And when I was selling real estate, you put in, I'm going to charge you a 6% commission. I'm going to have 3%, listing agent 3%, selling agent, which we call the buyer's agent, selling agent 3%. And most people kind of would ride over that. There was no great definition as to why that took place and why that way.
It was about as quick as that.
If you want other people to show the property, we got to offer them something. And so I'm going to take 3% to be the listing agent, and I'm going to offer 3% to the person who brings in a buyer, and that's the way it is. And now they're saying no compensation in this particular case. But remember, there are other cases that want to drive this clause out of the NAR model as well. Right. To make the compensation paid to a buyer's agent voluntary and informed by the seller. And the belief is this will save sellers and real estate consumers millions of dollars. And the case, so that means what? Somebody's going to get less commission.
I don't know that it would necessarily save consumers. Depends on which consumer you are, right? But theoretically, the seller's not going to accept an offer that financially doesn't make sense to them, right? So maybe now they would accept something lower if they're paying less commission.
Well, now here's what happens in this particular case. So let's say the listing agent says they want 3 and the seller says I'll offer the buyer agent 1. Right? The buyer agent they can include that in the offer and say, I want 3, in which case their offer is dead because they've just countered the offer, right? So they basically refuted that offer, and the seller doesn't have to accept it. And then at that point, that commission to the buyer's agent becomes negotiated between all parties.
Right.
Between the seller, between the buyer, between the buyer's agent, and between the seller's agent.
Right. Or you're going to see a lot more requests for buyers coming in with their offers asking for closing cost credits for their closing costs, of which their buyer agent compensation is considered a closing cost.
Yeah, and now it makes
so they're
more
going to
sense.
use the contract for that.
It makes more sense.
That's going to make it the easiest way to do it.
Yeah, well, if you had a buyer agent contract, now you'd say, here's what I'm going to charge you. I'm going to charge you 3%. In some cases, the seller might pay. If the seller pays 1%, then I'll ask you, the buyer, to pay me the other 2%, and you put that in the buyer broker agreement, right?
Exactly. So this is also going to force buyer agent hands to use the buyer agency agreement, which we've been trying to get people to use for a very long time.
Exactly.
So that's I think it's big news. I think an MLS agreeing to pay $3 million is a big deal. And while other people don't think it will change the industry at all,
100% will.
I think change doesn't happen all at once. Change bubbles along. It changes, it changes like your kids growing up. You don't really notice that they're growing up. All of a sudden they're growing up, right? And so it takes time, and all of these things are moving.
Yeah.
And someday everybody's going to wake up and there's going to be a different model.
Yep.
Right.
And now they bring into this, maybe buyers are going to now start to think, with artificial intelligence, why do I even need, I don't need fiduciary representation.
Right.
I don't need it. I don't want it. I'm not going to pay for it. And you know what? Prior to 1992, they didn't.
Right.
I know.
And
I mean,
that's why our new listing agreements cover unrepresented buyers too, because we're seeing more of it. And we're already seeing in our market, in our MLS too, if I pull up a report that says here, because if I have a conversation with the seller and if we're listing their property and I say, what do you want to pay the buyer agent? They said, well, what's standard? Well, there is no standard. Why don't we look at everything that's on the market right now and what sellers are paying out to buyer brokers? Right. And, you used to have a pretty consistent number throughout that whole list. And now there's that variety is growing. Every time I pull that report up, you have a wider variety of numbers being offered there too. So it's happening. Well, but I think there's a lot of agents that are just, I had an agent text me the other day and say, what's up with these lawsuits? I don't know what's going on. And I was like,
here's another thing, Rachel, Jennifer, when the market is good, right? When you can put a sign on the property or just expose it and you got a bunch of offers, multiple offers on it.
Right.
And the seller is not going to be inclined to say, I'm willing to pay a commission to a buyer agent. Why would they?
Right. It's very interesting because I've had this conversation with several sellers between the time our new listing agreement came out and now. It's been a couple of months. And there's no rhyme or reason as to which way somebody's going to go with that conversation. I had one say, well, why would I offer to pay them anything? I don't have to. So, I can stick my sign in, you can stick your sign in the ground and we'll have a buyer. It's not a problem. And then I have other ones going, wait a minute, why would I pay you? And why would I pay them any less than I'm paying you? So it's I think it's very much a personal thing. And it's based on the individual seller. So I haven't found anything consistent yet with regard to the response of the seller from that conversation. But it is an interesting conversation I think because all of them finished the conversation with, Jesus, why did we have to spend 20 minutes talking about this?
Yeah, well, but commissions are significant.
Exactly.
You take 3% of $500,000, you're talking real money. And if a seller has an opportunity to save 15 grand,
you bet they're going to do it.
I take it. Yeah, exactly. Well, these lawsuits, there's always updates. There's always things changing. So if people want to stay updated on this, what resources can they check out? Yeah,
they can come see us on Facebook, Real Talk, or they can try to find me on Facebook, or we have a blog, thedataadvocate.com. Or you can send me an email, Saul@bettercallsaul.realtor, and I'll get back to you.
Nice. And then Rachel, if people have a referral for you in Chicago, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
The best way to reach me is by cell phone at 630-542-8688 or via email at rreal@dealwithreal.com.
Awesome. And if you're a real estate agent and you're looking to partner with Monica and I to help grow your business, or you're looking to join EXP, give me a call or a text at 513-400-1691. All right. Thanks, guys.
Good seeing you.
Thanks, everybody.
Happy 4th of July.